So, this is the one I know at least one of you has been waiting for. It's one I've been waiting for as well. This is the definitive list. This is a top 10 list from GTA 4, and it is about 6-star getaway vehicles. It includes honorable mentions as well, which I'll get to a little bit later. There are some interesting picks here, to say the least. Now, why did this not happen until very recently? Well, it's because if you've ever done a sort of comparo, so to speak, and Motor Trend and some other publications, when they do a big multi-vehicle comparison test or a story about these sort of things, they say it's usually very easy to pick the top and bottom of the list. Where things get really annoying and tend to take more time and effort to flesh out are the mid-pack. For example, my top 4 picks, they only one of them switched positions. My middle towards the bottom picks, they changed a lot, and actually my number 10 pick changed as well. And I drove pretty much all of these cars back to back. I did a couple of getaways with them, and then really compared my notes as to what I noted at them earlier. Because this document I have, I'm looking at it in open office here. This document dates back to I think 2015, or at the very, very latest, early 2016. So it's not like I haven't been thinking about this, because looking back at other games I do this stuff for, I've done hit lists, so to speak, and top whatever number things for various games. And like I said, it was really easy to find the top picks. It was really, really easy. I knew right number 1 and number 2 were going to be the News Cruiser and the Faction, and I think you guys could have seen that one coming as well. I sing the News Cruiser's praises to the point of fanboyism, which, if you know anything about my preferences for cars in the real world, makes a lot of sense. When you get to drive a encapsulated version of your favorite project car that is hopefully going to get done next year, it sounds like a common little, almost what do you say, almost like a running joke at this point. But it does, and the fact that no other car in this list makes me feel that way when I drive it, and no other car in this list gives me the kind of confidence that the News Cruiser does. The News Cruiser is a car that just refuses to suck in any category. It's a car that's got good ground clearance, it's also decently quick, it stops well, and it corners well. You could argue, it also has decently strong wheels as well. It's not easy to buckle those wheels all the way in. Of course, because it's a police vehicle, you get sirens, which you can use to redirect traffic. Depending on how you do it, you can either do it to your benefit or to your detriment. Obviously, I prefer to do it to my benefit. It's fun making, almost what do you say, impromptu roadblocks for the various oink behind you. And it's a car that, the News Cruiser, certainly on paper, it looks like a decent candidate for this list, because it's not the slowest car here. Not even close. There are 2 cars, possibly 3, that are much slower. Not much slower, but definitely slower, relatively speaking. And, every other car on this list, every single pick from number 2 to number 10, they have something wrong with them. They have a very definitive weak spot. Take, for example, the Faction, the number 2 pick, which I'll get to in a bit. That car is stupidly good. And actually in most conditions, it is actually faster than the News Cruiser. If obviously, if I cared to measure the exact average speed through a section, I'll bet you money the Faction's quicker through 90% of the roads that I drive on in Broker and Alderney as well. But the difference between the News Cruiser and the Faction is that the News Cruiser, you can drive the car at 10 tenths, and you can keep driving it like that, and it's not gonna do anything crazy. It's a weird feeling too, because when you're really cooking in the News Cruiser, you think, God, this is based off of a civilian, basically a luxury sedan / senior citizen mobile. There's no way this thing can be this good to drive, but it is. The News Cruiser is a car that I have done some of my biggest, most epic comebacks when I think that everything has gone wrong in the getaway. I've got buckled wheels, I'm out of position, there are FIB Buffaloes with their aimbotting, and they're closing in on me, and I think this is it. And then the car just somehow holds together, and also somehow posts really good average speeds through sections as well, in spite of everything. And the News Cruiser is proof positive that you can change the momentum of a getaway whenever you want. You just have to switch it on. And like I said, no other car lets me do that. It's a car that gives you ultimate confidence. When you drive a news cruiser, you know you can win. You just have, sometimes it just takes a while to find a way to do it. And it has earned its place at the top of the list. However, I mentioned the Faction, which is my number 2 pick. The Faction is a better car than the news cruiser on tarmac. Most situations, at least. Now, that's not to say the Faction is necessarily easier to drive than the news cruiser, because it's not. The Faction is, it's definitely quicker in a straight line, but not by very much. I mean, the drag race would be far closer than you would imagine, despite the Faction looking like some badass G-body Buick and the news cruiser looking like a pedestrian, 92 to 94 Grand Mark and 98 to 02 or so Crown Victoria. It's, you would not expect the news cruiser to do well, but I'm getting off track. The Faction is a car that is loose. It is a car that is fast. It has good ground clearance and it has good brakes. Already you say, how come you didn't pick this over the news cruiser? Why does the Faction not get the nod over the news cruiser? It's because the Faction sucks in the dirt. It is one of the only cars in this list that has genuinely bad handling in the dirt. On top of having the steepest learning curve out of all the cars in the list as well. I mean, the fact that I picked the Faction number 2 in spite of both of these issues is a testament to how good the car really is. I mean, the Faction, you gotta know how to drive that motherfucker on tarmac, but you will post insane speeds through sections with that car. Absolutely insane. And because it's like the news cruiser and it has good ground clearance, you can take bumps and hop curbs and climb vertical obstacles, and it really doesn't matter if you're willing to learn how to drive it. It kind of reminds me of the Sopwith Camel, if you follow early combat aviation history. I mean, that plane had a terrible reputation as being a plane that was likely to kill you if you didn't know how to fly it, but on the other hand, it was better at dogfighting than most everything in the Allies' fleet. So that should tell you something. And then that's really why I respect the Faction as much as I do, because there are cars and weapons and planes and tanks and vehicles like that in every game. Or a vehicle that just requires a really, really dedicated driver to learn it. But it's trust me, it's worth it. If you were ever on the fence about saying, oh, I want a challenge and I want to drive fast, Faction's your car. That being said, I mentioned earlier that the Faction sucks on the dirt. I mean, it really, really, really sucks on the dirt. It is, it's annoying even, because it doesn't seem to want to pick what it wants to do when it loses grip. It feels like the front and the rear suspension of the car are fighting each other. I mean, unless you are perfectly smooth through your inputs of throttle, brake, and accelerator, it's going to understeer and it's going to oversteer. It's going to switch between the two, and it's no other car on this list feels that bad in the dirt, which is saying something, because obviously off-road ability is very, very different across this class. I mean, some cars like the Faction may as well be a dumpster fire. Shout out to Urinating Tree for that little moniker. And then other cars like the Marbella and the Sabre, they don't give a fuck. I mean, they just glide right through this stuff, and it's really bizarre. Because with the Regal/Faction, it really is just a really strange difference. Because on tarmac, it's extremely fast. On dirt, maybe it's fast, but you have to. It's not. You don't feel like pushing the car hard on the dirt. Yeah, it can handle a quick transition, but say you want to go underneath the expressway near the airport in Broker, you're not going to have a good time. You are going to hate the car, probably. I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, the getaways that I post, I made sure the Faction's one of the few cars in this list that I have to practice with a lot before I can drive really fast in it. Some of these cars I just get in and drive, as you can probably tell. And then I progressively get better as the series goes on. The Faction's a car that, especially in the dirt, you really got to know how it's going to be. Because, say, for example, I'm going into a turn and the car was plowing. So I step on the gas hard to try and, obviously, make that understeer go away. But then I do it too much, and then the car, oversteers and turns way too tightly, and then I try to countersteer, and by that point, I have already kissed a concrete pillar, and thus earned the Pillar Driver signature takedown, which is not what you want to do. You want to earn that on your enemies and not on yourself. And like I said, that's the only glaring flaw in the Faction's game. If the Faction had even slightly better off-road manners, it would be my number 1 pick. That should tell you just how close the number 1 or number 2 are. I mean, the fact that it not only can carry its speed better through most sections than the news cruiser can on tarmac, but it is also quicker in a straight line. That's crazy. I mean, that's that's another reason why I like driving it. The fact that, yeah, it's very loose, but it's very fast. And it rewards skilled drivers better than pretty much any other car on this list, second only to the News Cruiser. Incredible car, worth driving, and if you haven't yet, drive it, and if you don't have one in your fleet, well then get one, because it's amazing. And you don't even need the DLCs to have that car. Fun fact. Now, this is where things get a little goofier. Number 3 is the Vigoro. This actually used to be my number 4 pick, but I bumped it up after some hilarious getaways with it that I probably shouldn't have lost, but because the Vigoro had a unique combination of features I was able to pull off. Let's compare this to the Faction, the pick above it. The Vigoro, it's slower. It's not as loose, but it's still somewhat loose. So it has good reflexes, and it can dart around, but it's about as good as a News Cruiser in that regard. I mean, like I said, it's good, but it's not going to be as fast on tarmac as the Faction will be. It's maybe, depending on the terrain, it may be a little bit quicker than a News Cruiser, but questionable. Thankfully, though, I mean, it's got a lot of the good qualities of those cars. I mean, it's got good ground clearance. It handles bumps really well. You know, the only issue with the Vigoro is that it's a little weird to learn how to brake with. I mean, it's got a very heavy front brake pads, and obviously it's not that hard to learn. I mean, you see in my getaways, I stopped that sucker on the dime, but initially it's a little weird to drive. It's not bad, though, and the learning curve is definitely flatter than that of the Faction. I mean, any car here is easier to drive initially than the Faction, and that's saying a lot. Except maybe the Comet, but that's another story. But it's the only issue I see with the Vigoro is that it's a little bit wider than the Faction, but it's also a little bit slower, so it can't really get in and out of impossible situations quite as well. I mean, it still does very well. It's my number 3 pick, but yeah, I think I have a right to split hairs at this point. I mean, there are no fewer than 50 cars in GTA 4, and I'm choosing 3 of them to be my mainstays of my fleet. I have a fucking right to be picky about these suckers, and so I am. Now, what's the Vigoro has over the Faction, though, is that it's probably a slightly better car across multiple situations. And, in other words, the Vigoro, yeah, it's definitely slower across most sections on tarmac than the Faction is, but I can guarantee the Vigoro is faster on most off-road sections than the Faction. So say for whatever reason you find yourself cutting through grassy areas with the car a lot, the Vigoro is going to be just fine. You say you want to go along the beach in Alderney, or like I said before, the airport forest area in Broker. Vigoro's going to do pretty good there. It's still not as good as the News Cruiser or the Police Patrol or some of the other cars on this list, but it's not bad. I mean, it's controllable, and you can go decently quick through it. I mean, I have some footage from getaways that I haven't even transferred them from my camera yet, but you can see I get her going pretty good in the dirt, and I have a grand old time doing it. So that's what I mean about the Vigoro, though. I mean, it's a more well-rounded car, and so certainly if you're looking to get into fast, somewhat loose-handling cars, I would start with the Vigoro, because it teaches you, yeah, you need to be smooth, but you've got more of a safety net than the Faction, because the Vigoro just isn't as loose. And also, the Vigoro can actually handle itself worth a shit on the dirt, so that's also very useful. Now, here's my number 4 pick. This is the Police Patrol. This was my number 3 pick, but I switched it with the Vigoro, just because I realize some of the Police Patrol's flaws now. In my initial notes on the Police Patrol, I said, yeah, it's not as quick as the News Cruiser or the Faction. And it's true. And actually, it's not even as quick as the Vigoro. And the Vigoro is already a little bit slower than the Faction. And so, the Police Patrol, it relies on handling far more than any of these other top 4 cars. I mean, it's not slow. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it'll handily beat an Intruder VX in a drag race. It'll beat a Sabre in a drag race. It'll beat a Marbella in a drag race. But it's not going to beat the Vigoro. It's not going to lose by very much, but this should tell you something. I mean, the Police Patrol, it can't rely on speed to get in and out of impossible situations as well. I mean, this is almost one step further away from some of these, from the Vigoro and the Faction type. I mean, the Police Patrol, it's not particularly loose either. I mean, it doesn't understeer very much at all. I do like that. I mean, the Police Patrol reminds me a lot of my Grand Marquis. It also reminds me a lot of the News Cruiser. It's lively. It's quick. It darts really, really well. It ducks and weaves, and the brakes on the Police Patrol are insane. The most obvious benefit of this is that it comes with anti-lock brakes. Now, in GTA 4, It's not like Forza 4 and some of these other racing games. In GTA 4, best case scenario of you using a car without ABS and properly braking, you stop this at approximately or very close to the same amount of time that it would take if you had a car with ABS. In other words, you want to have every car to have ABS because the penalties for locking your tires in GTA 4, they're not as steep as they are in some racing games, but it isn't good to blow an apex or not be able to take a turn as tightly as you wanted to. But with the police patrol, there's really no chance of that happening because it comes with the anti-lock brake standard. And it also has really good off-road manners. I mean, the police patrol, you can duck and weave and have a grand old time off-road, even more so than the Vigor. I mean, we're getting towards more forgiving and handling-centric cars here. I mean, out of the top 4 on this list, the police patrol is by far the slowest. And it shows. I mean, it's, you got to have your foot to the floor often with the car, but it's not annoyingly slow. Like I said, it's and the fact that I rank a car that is this slow in my top 4 is very telling. That should really tell you that the police patrol has a combination of durability, ground clearance, and handling that most other cars don't have. It also helps that the police patrol is anorexic. It is incredibly thin. It's thinner than the Vigoro. It's thinner than the Faction. It's thinner than the Noose Cruiser. It's thinner than the I don't know if it's thinner than the Mafia Shafter, but it's pretty darn close, and that car gets in and out of tight spaces stupidly well. And I feel the same way driving the police patrol, just the police patrol's a better package overall. And so this is why I like the police patrol. I mean, if you want a car that is putting handling and braking first, followed very closely by ground clearance, off-road manners, and obstacle climbing / handling bumps, yeah, police patrol is definitely the handler's choice. I mean, the tighter the train gets, the better the car gets. Because at that point, it's not as much about acceleration. It's more about brakes and cornering. And the police patrol's got them both. God bless that car. I have a great time driving it. Now for the first DLC car, and I think one of only 2 on this entire list. The Civilian Buffalo. This car used to be my number 6 pick. I bumped it up over the Ruiner because it is amazing on tarmac. Civilian Buffalo is a car that quite literally you can dominate on tarmac with. It is like a Faction, except somehow more loose, but more grippy, quicker to accelerate, quicker to brake. It reminds me of a Faction that, it's almost like the Need for Speed edition of the Willard Faction. It offers improved acceleration and a slightly higher top speed. That's what I feel like driving the Civilian Buffalo. Except it's weird because it's somehow also more forgiving, while also being insanely fast in a straight line, and also being really, really darty and maneuverable in turns. You pay a price for this, though. Unlike the Faction, you don't have that good ground clearance. You'll handle the bumps well because your suspension does have a decent amount of travel, but your car sits low to the ground. It's weird. There aren't many cars in GTA that have this weird ability of handling bumps, but not being able to climb vertical obstacles, such as staircases. But the Buffalo is one such car. And also the Buffalo is extremely fat. It is the fattest car here by a pretty healthy margin. It's fatter than even the Police Buffalo, which I will mention later. It's fatter than the Ruiner, which is hilarious, because the Ruiner's already way too fat. But this is what happens. I mean, and that's why I like the Civilian Buffalo. You have to pay a price for this sort of, I'd certainly in this top 10 list, this kind of dominating performance on tarmac. I mean, this will blow the Faction out of the water on tarmac. Easily. Unless you have to climb things, or unless you have to, get in and out of tight spaces. I mean, the Civilian Buffalo has a steeper learning curve than I'm leading on to here, because, yeah, it will dominate on tarmac, and you've seen, go watch some getaways with the Buffalo. I bend the LCPD over on their back and break them with it, and it's hilarious. But you can't do that all the time with the Civilian Buffalo, because there are certain areas that there's just too much car. It's too fat. It's too wide. There's not enough space. There's not enough horizontal space to make the car go fast. I mean, obviously it's still really good because I'm putting it number 5 out of 10, but that width really, really gets in the way. I mean, this car, more than any other car here, you got to mind the width on. It's worth it, though. And the fact that these things are a dime a dozen in the Ballad of Gay Tony, yeah, worth adding to your fleet. And there are a bunch of cool, unique variants of it, too. You want to get a Drug Wars purple pearlescent paint job? That reminds me of the old Hot Pursuit 2 on the PS2 with those, I think it was the Ferrari 550 Barchetta and the Ferrari F50 Need for Speed editions. Those look pretty hot. I like those. I feel the same way about the Buffalo. Very hot. Very good. Do need practice, though, and seriously mind the width. Whatever you do. Oh, and actually, before I forget to mention, Civilian Buffalo also has some really good off-road manners, which is just, like I said, it's just silly. It's just such a goofy car. But you have to be careful, though, because of the Civilian Buffalo, when you're driving it off-road quickly, the car seemingly shrinks around you without actually getting smaller in the game world. So, mind the width. Number 6 is the Police Buffalo. This is from the Ballad of Gay Tony. It's only acquirable through normal means in multiplayer, though. I'm sure those of us who are smart and use the simple native trainer, we can spawn one in single player and do various things with it. The Police Buffalo is basically what the FIB Buffalo should have been. Yeah, you say what you will about the Buffalo and its decent acceleration and speed. It's wide, because that's how all the Buffalo-based cars are in GTA 4. They're all wide. It's not quite as wide as a Civilian Buffalo, but you do have to mind the width on this car too. But unlike the FIB Buffalo, you actually have ground clearance, so you can climb things. You can hop vertical obstacles pretty well. I mean, it's still not going to be as good as a faction or a news cruiser or a police patrol, but it'll do pretty well. Far better than the FIB Buffalo could ever hope for. Obviously, that's the only change between that and the FIB Buffalo. The handling is identical. And so, I mean, I don't have a lot of getaways posted with the Police Buffalo, but believe me, it's a very fun car, and it has earned its place at number 6 through and through. It has, obviously, if you know how the FIB Buffalo drive, it's got a bit of understeer to it, but I'm okay with that because it makes up for it in other ways. I mean, just because a car has a touch of understeer doesn't automatically mean it's a turd. I mean, it's annoying at times, but unlike with the FIB Buffalo, you start understeering. Say I'm going into a turn, I'm coming in too fast, or I don't transfer weight and get the back to step out soon enough. Okay, fine, whatever. I can hit something. I can hit a vertical obstacle, or I can be forced to do something stupid to avoid totally trashing the car. And I can have confidence in knowing that I'm not going to take suspension damage from doing it because I've got more ground clearance than the FIB Buffalo. The FIB Buffalo, you have to do stupid things to avoid taking wheel damage. And yeah, the Police Buffalo the wheels will take damage if they get hit, but it's almost like they have more preventative armor. In other words, because the Police Buffalo has better ground clearance, it simply isn't subjected to things that damage the wheels critically anywhere near as often as the police version. It's a really good car. I mean, if something like the Civilian Buffalo is too fast for you, but you want something that's still pretty fun to drive and can handle itself against fast cars and difficult terrain, Police Buffalo is your choice. I mean, that's a really solid number 6 pick. Worth its weight in gold. Number 7 is the DF890 V8 Turbo. This is a really interesting car. It has better acceleration, less understeer, but it's also longer. And it's also a little bit narrower than the Police Buffalo. But the wheels are really, really weak. I mean, we're talking Oracle XS levels of weakness on the wheels. And you have a little bit less ground clearance than the Police Buffalo. Now, the DF890 is a weird car because if you look at ground clearance for a lot of these, it's a little bit better than the Ruiner and the FIB Buffalo, but it's worse than the Police Buffalo. And you have much more fragile wheels. So the DF890 is kind of a high-risk, high-reward car because in a straight line, it'll beat the Police Buffalo. It won't understeer as much as the Police Buffalo either. Not that the Police Buffalo has a lot of it, but you can tell it has some compared to other cars here. But this is the problem with the DF890. I mean, the fact that it simultaneously has less ground clearance and more damaging wheels, I don't want to have to think about that when I'm whipping around. I mean, the car is very quick. I mean, it would be a pretty close match for the faction, actually, now that I think about it. The DF8's a very, very quick car. It doesn't look at it. It looks kind of goofy. It looks like a Pontiac G8 and then an Infiniti Q35 and a lot of other weird things, but it's a cool car. It's a very cool car. It's just not practical enough to be higher than my number 7 pick. It's just not there. And this actually gets me into the Ruiner. So the Ruiner, why would I drive this over the DF890? I don't know. I have slightly stronger wheels. but I have worse ground clearance, and I'm wider. So at that point, you're kind of picking between parts that don't really help. And also, I have a little bit more understeer than the DF890. And this is where the Ruiner runs into trouble. I mean, it's a good car. I mean, if we didn't have the civilian Buffalo and the police Buffalo, the Ruiner would be my number 6 pick, which is pretty interesting. It's because it's already down here at number 8. But think about it. I mean, a car that is wider already has more problems getting in and getting out of tight spaces than, say, a narrower car like a police patrol. But on the other hand, the Ruiner has more understeer as well, so it's going to be forced into those awkward situations more often. And don't say understeer is meaningless in the real world, because when you're whipping around at 6 stars, the last thing I like to deal with is understeer. I want to be able to steer the car. Yeah, if I have a loose car, so what? Maybe I'll spin out a couple times, but I'll learn how to control it. And oversteer is more useful than understeer in most situations in GTA 4, certainly in 6-star getaways, and that's really what this list is about. You know, the Ruiner's a decent car, though. I mean, it's quick in a straight line. Not quite as quick as a DF8. It would be a close drag race between that and DF8. I shouldn't say that, and it stops pretty well too. And it's got good off-road manners. DF890's got good off-road manners too. But the not news cruiser. God damn it. But the Ruiner just does more things wrong while being a similar package. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, if you're going to go high risk, high reward, then do it all the way and do a DF890. You have less understeer. You have a little bit better ground clearance, but you have much, much weaker wheels. But at least then you have some clear advantage in that, and you can get in and get out of tight situations better. I mean, with the Ruiner, yeah, the suspension durability is slightly better, but because the car is wider, it almost doesn't matter, because when you find yourself in tight situations, your wheels are more likely to get hit and get hard. And then get hit and get hit hard, I should say. Not get hard, that's what penises do. That was weird. And that's what I mean. I mean, yeah, if you're really, really diligent, you can probably use the Ruiner's slightly better ground clearance over the DF8 to a definitive advantage, but it just doesn't make sense. I mean, it's a cool car, and I like its paint jobs, and it's definitely fun to drive, but there are much, much, much better picks on this list. Now, we're getting toward the bottom of the barrel here, and things are getting weird. You're wondering, why haven't I heard from the Mafia Shafter yet? Well, because there are much better cars in it. I mean, it's a fun car, and actually, it was the first car I ever did a lot of 6-star getaways with. It's kind of a weird car. It reminds me of a police patrol that lost ground clearance, but gained a little bit more acceleration, and retained good brakes and bump handling abilities. But because of this, the Mafia Shafter is very much a one-trick pony. The Mafia Shafter, the only thing it does better than a lot of other cars is handle and get in and out of tight situations and brake. It's basically a pure handling car. Literally, it can only handle. It can't outrun. It can't outrun very well. I mean, obviously, I've outrun choppers with it. You watch my older getaways. Yeah, you can get her going. You can outrun choppers and other things with it, but that's not what it likes to do. You can't climb vertical obstacles either, because the ground clearance is garbage. But you're really narrow, like the police patrol, and you're only slightly, maybe quick. Like I said, a police patrol and Mafia Shafter drag race would be very, very close. I imagine Mafia Shafter would have a teeny tiny bit of an advantage off the line, but I don't know how the race would end. It would be very close, and I'd like to see that sometime. Perhaps I will stage one. But that's about as... the Mafia Shafter just doesn't make sense in a lot of situations, though, because, yeah, like a police patrol, it's narrow, and it handles, and it brakes. It does that really, really well. But, unlike the police patrol, it doesn't have ground clearance. I mean, it has good off-road manners, but it doesn't have ground clearance, and the wheels are weaker. So, once again, we have this combination of kind of slow, kind of fragile when it comes to wheels, and not very able to climb vertical obstacles. I mean, it does okay with what it does. I mean, it's better than the Ruiner. It's better than, some other cars in the game. It's better than the Comet. It's not saying much. It's better, And so this is what I mean. I mean, the Mafia Shafter, it becomes outclassed very quickly once you expand the field to more purpose-built 6-star getaway cars. That being said, I first learned to drive fast with the Mafia Shafter. I mean, there's very little understeer in the car. and the oversteer that it has tends to be forgiving because, it's kind of slow. So like the police patrol, it's hard to overwhelm the rear tires and truly go nuts and spin out with the car. I mean, unless you're really caning it and just driving it like a caveman, it'll do what you ask for it more often than not. And so certainly, if you're just starting to get into 6-star getaways, yeah, I would probably start with a Mafia Shafter. It's not a bad car. I mean, and there are better choices like Police Patrol. But say you want something different. Say you want something that's a little harder, or say something that forces you to think your terrain over a little more carefully, while also teaching you how to outhandle things instead of outrun things. Yeah, take a Mafia Shafter. Or if you just want something that's a little more challenging. I mean, that's not to say 6-star getaways, I mean, they're not that hard for me now. I can usually lose them within 10 minutes of focused driving. And, just because a car is better at 6-star getaways, that usually means that it's more fun as well. Although I do usually have more fun in my faction than I do my news cruiser. That's just because the faction is just crazy on tarmac. It's so much fun once you know how to drive it. But and then that's what I give the Mafia Shafter credit for. I mean, it's not trying to be anything other than a Mafia Shafter. It's a car that's light, it's nimble, it's narrow, it handles bumps, it brakes, it handles. It does decent off-road too. Just don't try to climb things with it and don't try to outrun things. Because if you try to do that, you'll be out of your element and not very happy. I mean, it is fun when you get on a roll with the Mafia Shafter, though. When you string together a bunch of corners and you can feel your speed and your smoothness get better, and it feels great. It's a fun car, but it's just not practical now. There are much better choices out there in GTA 4 land, at least from what I've seen and driven. This kind of gets me to another interesting car. Number 10 is the Sabre. Not the Sabre GT. That car's a piece of shit. The Sabre. Just the G-body Grand Prix / Monte Carlo. This is an interesting car. It has ground clearance. It has so much... It's basically a truck level of ground clearance. It's stupid. It also has a lot of suspension travel. So take a wild guess what car you'll never bottom out or, break a wheel hitting a bump with. Sabre. The car is just unbelievably adept at that. It's kind of slow, though. And the fact that a Mafia Shafter can hang with a Sabre, which is a far sportier appearing car, it's kind of sad. I mean, the Sabre is really, really slow compared to all the other cars I've gone over. It certainly can be a Vigor and a faction, a news cruiser will easily outrun a Sabre in drag race. I mean, it's not as bad as some other cars. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I am kind of going a little over the top about the Sabre being slow, but it's not that quick. The Sabre is getting closer to the dangerously slow territory. It's still a good car. I mean, and in terms of driving dynamics, certainly off-road, this thing is hilariously forgiving. It is the total opposite of the faction. While the faction, you're fighting it in the dirt, the Sabre, it just wants to be your friend. I mean, you can be a ham-fisted idiot in the Sabre on the dirt, and you won't have many issues at all. Which is saying a lot, because you can't be a ham-fisted idiot with the faction in the dirt, because if you do, you crash, and it's really bad. But this is kind of a weird car, because the Sabre, out of all the cars I've gone over here, the Sabre's got the most understeer. So when you really need the car to buckle down and do some tight turns and giddy up and dodge some cars, it's not going to want to do it. It's going to fight you. I mean, it's not obnoxious about it, but you just have to know that the Sabre, it doesn't like those kind of tight turns. I mean, it can handle bumps well, and it can climb obstacles with the best of them. But that's really all it does. I mean, it's a fun car, and it's earned, even to get on this top 10 list, I think is pretty incredible. It's just outclassed. I mean, the extra suspension durability and extra ground clearance and even better handling of bumps, at that point, you don't need it more often than not. I mean, unless you are just going full, rock crawling or Jurassic Park driving with the thing, you really don't need it very often in the real world. Hence where it sits at number 10. It's a good car. I like it, but I definitely don't love it. It's not bad, though. So, that's the main list. Now, what about cars that were almost good enough to make it, but not quite? Honorable mention 1 is the Marbella. I don't really know what class this is in. It's not a muscle car, but it's not a sports sedan. It's kind of a weird car. Yeah, it's somewhere between the two. And the Marbella, it's slow. It's definitely slower than the Sabre. The Marbella is in the dangerously slow category, but it's really nimble, and it has probably just as good ground clearance. It has very little understeer, far less so than the Sabre, and it handles. It handles really, really well, and it's also pretty strong, much like the Sabre is. And actually, if you're looking to get into a car that drives like other cars on my infamous top 10 list, if you're looking to just start slow, start with a Marbella. You'll be very pleasantly surprised with how it can duck and weave and while also simultaneously climb vertical obstacles and handle bumps. What car does that sound like? It sounds like the Faction, just really, really slow. I mean, really slow. I mean, a Marbella versus an Intruder VX would be a close drag race. That should tell you quite a lot. It's a good car, but it is the most one-dimensional car on this list, by far. It relies on its handling. That's because that's all it has. The Mafia Shafter, it's at least somewhat, maybe slightly quick. Marbella is not trying to be quick. The Marbella is neutered and very slow, but it handles really good and it stops really good too. I mean, the Marbella is handling first, everything else second. I mean, and actually, despite it being based on, at least from the rear, an 80s town car, it would have been the 80 to 84 specifically. It's not very wide. I mean, you can get in and get out of tight spots really easily with the car. It's cool. But it's a totally different driving style from all these other cars, even more so than the Sabre. It's a good car. Worth driving, though. At least do a couple getaways with the Marbella. See how it feels to have to rely on handling and terrain instead of acceleration and handling and terrain to win. The Marbella makes you appreciate cars that can get out of their own way in a straight line and at least have some sort of power. Honorable mention in the police class is the FIB Buffalo. Basically, it's a police Buffalo with less ground clearance, which means it can't climb vertical obstacles, and it also will take suspension damage more easily, because if you do try to climb things, or you hit things at weird angles, it's more likely to damage the suspension. Not a bad car, though. Just there are much better choices. Muscle class car, I would say the Dukes. I mean, say what the Wikia for GTA 4 does not do a good job of describing the Dukes' handling at all. I mean, I question the individuals who write the reviews on these cars. I mean, do they know how to drive a car quickly? Do they know how to threshold brake? I don't think they do. Because they say, quote, unimpressive, sluggish handling, and, let me see. Oh, what did it have here? Oh, they had something about the brakes being bad as well. They added that. It's not there anymore, though. But they basically said the brakes were terrible on this car. I'm like, I remember I made a point of mentioning this in some getaways I did with the Dukes. I'm like, what the fuck are these kids talking about? Are we talking about the same car? That's not possible. It's interesting because actually the Dukes is quicker in a straight line than the Sabre GT. And yet the Wikia says, what's it say? Oh, unfortunately most of the power cannot be transferred to the wheels due to its heavy weight, which outweighs traction, resulting in slow acceleration. Bullshit! Dukes is pretty quick in a straight line. I mean, you have to learn how to launch it and properly apply the throttle. You can't just, stand on it. It doesn't really launch properly that way. But it's pretty good, and certainly once those rear tires hook up, it'll go. It's not super duper quick, but it's quick. It'll beat a Mafia Shafter in a drag race. It'll beat a police patrol in a drag race. Dukes versus Vigor drag race, I'm not sure. That would actually be pretty close. But, there are issues, though. I mean, the Dukes has good ground clearance and the wheels are strong, but it just feels weird when you drive it. Yeah, it will handle well, but you got to be careful with the brakes. I mean, the Dukes is surprisingly difficult to threshold brake with. I mean, I like the car, but it's really wide, and it's also really long. It's not as bad as the civilian Buffalo or the police Buffalo or the Ruiner, but it's getting there, and it's a big target. And while it is quick, honestly, it needs to be quicker. Because, yeah, I don't have as much issues with lateral space, or, or with horizontal space, but I have more issues with longitudinal space with that car. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten one of the quarters or one of the wheels punched in because I couldn't clear a section because the car is just so long. I mean, like I say, it's not as bad as some other cars in the game, but the Dukes can get hit very easily. Thankfully, the suspension is decently sturdy, but even if they don't hit a suspension, or even if they just hit a door or the rear quarter panel, you're losing speed, and it's gonna upset the car, and you're gonna lose your line. I mean, it's a fun car though, and don't think for a second that I'm hating on the Dukes because I do like it a lot, and it took a lot of thought to put this as an honorable mention and put the Sabre as number 9 because the Dukes it handles pretty good. I mean, it's not quite as good, but it had like I said, the ground clearance is definitely up to par, and the bump handling ability is good as well. It's just the Sabre is just hilariously good at it, and the Sabre. Yeah, it's got more understeer, but it's got even more ground clearance, and the Sabre's shorter. It's a little bit wider, but it's much shorter. So in reality, you can probably get in and out of tighter spots better in the Sabre than the Dukes. Which is weird because the Dukes is much quicker, but the Dukes is also much longer. Obviously, this list is subject to review, and now I feel like driving the Dukes and the Sabre back to back to see if I still feel this way. I mean, it's been a while since I've driven both those cars, but my notes were pretty accurate. Now, where things get a little weirder. I don't know. I make a clear differentiation between sport coupes and sport sedans. The cars like the Fortune and the Sentinel. And there are other sport coupes that I can't think of off the top of my head. Maybe this that's Sultan RS. That's a sport coupe. It's kind of goofy though. But and then sport sedans would be like something a Mafia PMP 600, Mafia Shafter, Oracle XS, fuck that car, piece of garbage. Presidente, pretty terrible as well. Needs help, basically. I mean, actually, side very quick tangent. I made an improved handling line for the Presidente in GTA 4. It's fun, and obviously, what I will want to do at some point if I ever get the space to reinstall 4 or somehow install the mod onto 360, I would want to drive the Presidente versus the top 4 cars and see how it does. Because with my edited handling, it's a really fun car. It is shockingly fun. It's actually real much. Honestly, it's what the Presidente should have been when GTA 4 shipped, but wasn't because Rockstar were chicken shits. I say this even though I give this game 10 stars out of no, not 10 stars, 9.5 stars out of 10, or 9 stars. Anyway, let's get to the honorable mention on the Fortune. Now, obviously, this is one of the cars I didn't really get a chance to drive very much, but from what I remember, it's weird. It's kind of slow, but it's not as bad as a Sabre or a Marbella. So it's slightly quicker than the Sabre, but it's definitely slower than a Dukes. It's also kind of wide and it's kind of long, but it handles really well, and it brakes really well. So it's this weird handling-centric marshmallow thing. It's weird. I mean, it's unlike driving any other car on this list, and I got you can actually carry some decent speed with it. You can climb things with it, and you'll handle bumps. I mean, it's not going to be as good as a Sabre, but it's going to get in and get out of situations better too. It's interesting, definitely worth trying if you're looking for something new and different and certainly unique. Because even the way it handles is it's weird, but it's cool. It's got a steeper learning curve than you may think because you think, oh, it's based off of an MN12 Thunderbird / Cougar. It's got to be great handling, and it's pretty good, but it's got a bit of a learning curve to it. Not as steep as something like the Faction or the Mafia PMP 600, which I'm going to get to, but it's definitely there. Now, sports sedan honorable mention is the Mafia PMP 600. This is a really interesting car. It's narrow, kind of, but it's really long. It also has really bad ground clearance and really weak wheels. But it's really quick, and it stops pretty good, too. And actually, it handles bumps surprisingly well. For the most part. I mean, my ideal PMP 600 would have the Mafia front grille and spoiler, but it wouldn't have the extended rocker panel trim, because that actually hurts your ground clearance a lot. But, I drove this and the Intruder VX back to back, and the PMP 600 was just a better choice. PMP 600, it's actually pretty loose. It's up there with the Faction, and it's it's really, really intense to drive fast, but you almost don't want to because the ground clearance is fucking awful. And the wheel durability is really bad too. In terms of wheel durability, the P&P 600 and the DF890 are pretty close. I think the P&P 600 wheels are even weaker than the DF890s, and that's saying a lot. The the P&P 600 and the Comet actually have the weakest wheels from what I've seen. I mean, they're really bad, and this is a problem because both cars are kind of fast, especially the Comet. But no, I mean, I'm not hating on the Mafia P&P 600 though. It's very quick. I mean, it's actually decent off road as well. I mean, like I say, it's not going to be as forgiving as a Sabre or a Police Patrol or even a Vigor. I mean, no, it's I'd say about Vigor levels of off road ability. It's not terrible, but it could be better. But for how quick the car is, I mean, the thing, it just gets up and goes. I mean, it's very quick. I mean, a drag race between the Mafia P&P 600 and a Faction and a Vigor would be pretty close. I mean, I imagine the P&P 600 would be between a Vigor and a Faction in that drag race. It would be very close. And that's kind of cool. Because, and also it helps that there's not a lot of understeer either. And so whatever little you get, you just squeeze harder on the throttle and it converts it into oversteer. So you can have a lot of fun with the Mafia P&P 600, but oh baby, you got to choose your terrain very carefully. You can't do a lot of vertical obstacle climbing, and it handles most bumps well, but it could be a lot better. I mean, I'd say it's very average in that regard. I mean, and I think part of that is because the Mafia version has those stupid rocker panel trim extension piece thingies, but yeah, it's a weird car. I mean, actually, out of all the cars here, I'd say the Mafia P&P 600 has the second highest learning curve, second only to the Faction. So, you want a challenge? Now you have two picks. Faction and Mafia P&P 600. Just the Faction's a much better package. And the Faction is more worthwhile to grind and learn. The P&P 600 is fun, and it can be quite hilarious, but that doesn't... I just don't feel the same way driving it fast like I do the Faction. And now the class that I literally drive two cars in, the exotic class. I drive the Coquette and the Comet. I ended up choosing the Comet. Yeah, it's got kind of goony handling, but it's really quick. It is scary quick, and it brakes pretty good too. Obviously, like most exotic cars, the wheel durability is garbage, and but it handles the bumps decently well. The Coquette handles them a little bit better, but the Comet doesn't do poorly under most conditions, and it's definitely a wild ride. And the fact that I haven't even come close to mastering the Comet. I mean, the Comet's being an honorable mention. It's not even in the official top 10 list. Yeah, I should tell you something. But you want to drive something that makes you think you're going to die at every point, but somehow lets you carry a ton of average speed, drive a Comet. That's the hardest car to drive here, by far. So there's my top 10 list. A couple surprises, a couple not surprises. It's interesting, though. I'd be curious to hear what you guys would be, at least your top 10 picks. The honorable mentions, you don't have to go into those unless you absolutely have nothing better to do except driving a bunch of ancient cars in an ancient game and take detailed notes and stuff like that. And also, along with that, what do you look for in a car in GTA, or in really any game in which driving is fun or something you do a lot? I mean, GTA 4, the most fun for me are 6-star getaways. But, the cars that are good at 6-star getaways are probably not the greatest cars for racing, depending on the track, of course. And I'm not even going to get into that. I mean, there are so many tracks in GTA 4 that I hardly ever drive because I just like doing getaways more. But it's an interesting list, and like I said, some of these are going to be subject to review. I have a feeling the Dukes is actually a better car than the Sabre, for example. And I imagine the Mafia P&P 600 might make it onto this list, but where would it go? That is the question. So I'll be tackling that in the coming months and just seeing. I'll be shaking trees and seeing what falls out. So thanks for watching. This has gone on way too long, but this had to be comprehensive because there is a lot going on. Enjoy and keep on getting on your getaways.